Hello ladies and gentlemen, Willie here. Raiding has always been one of the main diversions in World of Warcraft, and I'm very much aboard that train. Whilst it's proven to be quite a bit easier than many players had expected it to be in Classic, it's still something I regularly enjoy taking part in. Amongst all gameplay systems, raiding has changed a lot throughout the history of World of Warcraft, like a whole lot. Perhaps the area of the game that's received the most changes overall. Well, perhaps not by today's standards with all our new temporary power gain systems, but still, it's been pretty significant. I wanted to do a little video on how raiding has changed between vanilla and Wrath of the Lich King specifically, as well as why. 40-man raiding was only ever used during vanilla, despite Blizzard having such a massive player base that was only ever continually growing. In fact, I can't think of an MMORPG that has a real focus on the PvE scene and that also has raids where a 40-man system has actually worked out in the long term. Let's make a start. Vanilla. It launched with two raids, Onyxia's Lair and Molten Core, and early on into WoW, instances in general didn't have a cap on how many players you could bring along, up to 40. That's why 40-man raids ended up being the go-to number, as generally speaking, bringing more people to a raid makes encounters easier. This even extended to dungeons early on, where 10 to 20 people would have mini raids on places like Scholomance or Stratholme, so long as you're all grouped, of course. This was changed, and even now in Classic, the only dungeons capped at 5 are Blackrock Depths, Strat Undead and Living, and Scholomance. You could do a 10-man Zul'Farrak if you really wanted to, whilst UBRS has remained the first 10-man raid, I guess you could call it that, since you need to be in a raid to actually enter the place. The content does feel a bit more like a dungeon though, overall. The goal early on into the tiers were not necessarily around the volumes of players, but just how can we make this content amazing, even to the point where the concerns were not around the player volume or the difficulty of the content, but it was more around, well, let's take a look at this, shall we, from Jeff Kaplan.
I'll never raid. Why should I care about raid content in World of Warcraft? Well, we hear this all the time, and then people end up contradicting themselves. They actually end up raiding. So a lot of people say, I'll never, that's not something that I'll ever do. And then they'll get into that like one Zul'Gurub raid and go, that was so much fun. I got this awesome item. It's actually something I want to do.
It was logistically much more of a challenge too, which we can fully appreciate now looking back, not just in the volume of players needed, but people were using CRT monitors, absolute units of computers. Dial-up questing back then had far fewer add-ons and just general knowledge, limited information online. If it wasn't on Thoughtbot, you might just be completely stuck, and many players didn't even have raiding in their mind, so much as just hitting level 60 one day. And an epic item was really epic. Even as early as BlizzCon 2005, which was about a year after the launch of Vanilla, there were already issues starting to crop up around the raiding format that had been chosen, not only regarding the number of players needed, but the linear fashion in which raiding progressed that made life very difficult for raid leaders to maintain a healthy roster of sufficiently geared players, doubly so for the case moving into AQ40 and of course Naxxramas. Here's a few more words from Jeff on this.
Kind of the way that raid content has worked out so far in WoW has been very linear, and we feel like this causes a lot of problems. And then finally, bigger is not always better. What I'm talking about is raid size. Even hardcore raid players, and I know lots of them, and I am one myself, appreciate a smaller raid. Adding more people to a raid does not make it better somehow. If we can keep raid sizes smaller, each individual who shows up counts for more, and their decisions feel more impactful. It's much cooler if each person in the raid can feel like they're contributing to something, and we want every individual who shows up on your raid to feel like they matter. So that's what I mean by bigger is not always better.
Just to reiterate, that was from BlizzCon at the end of October 2005. WoW came out at the end of November 2004, so this was a thought process from very early on. So whilst aware of the issues and what kind of problems were cropping up, Blizzard did decide to press on with the raid size and linear formats for the remainder of Vanilla. And surely enough, by Naxxramas, with the pressures of having to have constantly raided, more requirements to have consumables, the steep difficulty curve, and TBC being announced a few months into progression, yes, whilst there was 6 months between Naxx release and TBC, the announcement came before that, well before that. very few people got to experience the dread citadel that was floating above the Eastern Plaguelands. Conversely, 20-man raids were considered quite a success, with high player engagement, which I reckon had quite a bit to do with their shorter lockout, more player responsibility due to raid size, or often having the same or even more mechanics than encounters found within 40-man raids. They also offered a good chance to quickly snap up high quality gear to get a foothold into the 40-man raiding scene. And in the Burning Crusade, Blizzard wanted to build on the areas where 40 and 20-man had proven problematic for them. To that end, raiding was split into two smaller numbers. 40 became 25-man and 20 became 10-man. The goals with these changes were twofold. Get each individual player to feel as though they matter a bit more in the efforts to take down bosses, and secondly, to get more people into the raiding scene and to make managing your raids that much easier. In a blog from Ian on how raids have changed, which I'm sure I'll be referencing a fair bit, this also got the friends and family groups into the game more. It wasn't any longer too much of an ask to have one or two pugs to join a group from your social circle from work, school, or just other gaming groups to give content a go. Even saying this now seems like such a different way to consider raids, as if you were going to Karazhan like you'd join a lobby of Among Us with a bunch of people. No expectations for gear, min-max, abyss, any of that, just to have some fun and see what the fuss is all about. On TBC launch, however, Blizzard considered the content overtuned for raiding. Magtheridon and Gruul's Lair were treated as successors to Naxxramas with similar levels of difficulty. This made it a challenge for the hardcore raider, but much too steep of an obstacle for the newer players or those dipping their toes into the content for the first time, and it was eventually nerfed, however, near the same patch that brought us the Black Temple. There was also more emphasis on catch-up gear or alternative progression paths in TBC to get into raids via dungeons, heroic dungeons, which not only provided epics in their own right, but badges to get strong gear from a deterministic means, that being the vendor in Shattrath, and later in the Isle of Keldanas, keeping the content lively and engaged with throughout the expansion. In patch 2.4 with the Sunwell and the expansion's final raid, it was very much akin to the spirit of how Naxxramas was treated, the top of the mountain, and once again you were expected to have raided extensively throughout the duration of the expansion, all the way through Mount Hyjal and the Black Temple in order to be able to compete here. By this point in time, players had become much more knowledgeable about the game in general, the consumables, hit caps, stat breakpoints, crit soft caps. It was no longer just napkin maths, but full-blown spreadsheets. Yet the content in the Sunwell was still an extremely stern challenge to take on, even for the best raiders in the world. What also came with the Sunwell, which Naxxramas did not have to help players catch up, was a whole host of new gear sources from the Isle of Keldanas badge vendor, as well as Magister's Terrace, which in its own right dropped very well statted items. Also, the need for achievements were dropped, as well as heroic dungeon keys being made available to Honoured from an earlier patch. The combination of these updates made newer or returning players have a much more accessible path to grind their way into the upper echelons of raid tiers without having to interact with the content from earlier parts of the game anywhere near as much as they would have returning in vanilla. And it still did take a good bit of grinding to get up to scratch. It wasn't any small feat to have done, but you did have somewhat more of a realistic chance to return and see the Sunwell more so than you ever would have returning late into vanilla to see Naxxramas. Speaking of Naxxramas in Wrath of the Lich King, here's where the most changes ever happened for raiding in the course of one expansion, or just raiding over any expansion ever for that matter. What happened in Wrath of the Lich King is truly mind-blowing. Interestingly, Ian Hazacostas started his position in World of Warcraft just prior to the Wrath of the Lich King launch, so he had input on encounter design from that point onwards. The first sweeping change to happen was to move away from raids being only 25 or 10 man to raids being 25 and 10 man, each one on a separate lockout. This allowed guilds and raids of varying different sizes to be able to experience the content, and this is the first real time that the idea of multiple difficulties for the same content was introduced. 25 man was tuned to be harder and to have greater rewards than 10 man did, as it was seen at the time as the top tier of raiding, which many 10-man guilds would go on to resent, as it's far more difficult for 10 people to upscale to 25 than vice versa. Naxxramas was back with some changes in there, and it was cleared in mere days from launch as the fastest new piece of content to be completed by players at the start of an expansion ever. I mean, things are time gated nowadays. It's just that Kel'Thuzad in Naxxramas Wrath of the Lich King went down faster than Ragnaros did in Classic, and that's a bit of perspective for you there. Blizzard erred on the side of caution to get more players into raiding, and to now treat each new expansion as its own entity rather than a successor to the end tier of the previous. Remember, overtuned Gruul and Mag on TBC release? However, the dial was turned a bit too far onto the accessible side, and achievements, however, were touted to be the real challenge. The speed clear of Eye of Eternity, of Naxxramas, the Undying, and so on. Yet for the most part, the challenge just wasn't quite there. That was, apart from Sotharian's Lair, where the free Drake's kill early on was considered one of the hardest pieces of content throughout the whole of Wrath of the Lich King. Not only this, but it awarded a unique mount and title, making it instantly recognisable that you had beaten this piece of content, and there were also varying levels of loot rewards for completing it with different number of Drakes alive. As Ian says here, the core philosophy here was simple. All players get to see the Obsidian Sanctum and experience the fights, but players looking for an extra challenge can take on a tougher version of the same encounter and be rewarded accordingly. As with many of our experiments, this one's success laid the groundwork for what was to come. And that groundwork was for hard mode to come in Ulduar, one of WoW's most legendary raid tiers. The idea of the 3 Drakes achievement in the Obsidian Sanctum was extended to many of the bosses within this new raid. Whilst Ulduar only had 25 or 10-man difficulties, at any point within the raid you could choose to take on a more challenging version of the encounters you were facing. Everybody gets to see the content, but the difficulty is now there for the competitive players. Fights like XT with the Heart, Freya with the Keepers, Hodia Speed Kill, Yogg-Saron with the Keepers, and the hard mode that required all other hard modes, Algalon the Observer. But this would be the only tier to ever have hard mode as a main component, as once again this was changed during the following raid, Trial of the Crusader. Here are a few more words from Ian on why this was changed. Whilst many players had and continue to hold a fondness for organic hard modes that could be enabled by specific actions within an encounter, they were inconsistent and often lacking clarity. Some of them, the Assembly of Iron, which was kill order, Freya, which had keepers, were elegant and intuitive, but others were frustrating or created traps for players. Whoops, you killed Hodia in 121 seconds? Try again next week. Or stop DPS, don't kill XT's heart. And moving forwards and relying on the fact that since the Burning Crusade, dungeons had had 2 difficulties, those being normal and heroic, it was decided that raids should have a similar treatment. So Trial of the Crusader released with 4 difficulties, 10 and 25 man normal and 10 and 25 man heroic, with Ian mentioning that the design intention was, functionally in terms of both tuning and itemization, we had 3 distinct levels of raid difficulty. The normal difficulty, which was 10 player normal, hard, which was 10 player heroic or 25 man normal, and very hard, 25 player heroic. It also introduced the attempt systems for heroic raiding, so you had to make sure that your preparation was there and you had taken lessons from the normal mode encounters. You couldn't just bash your head against these walls of encounters. The goal was for players to perfect encounters one at a time before having a real good chance at seeing some good attempts on the next one for the week. It may be of interest to note that at the time, we very nearly did not include a 10-player heroic difficulty at all. There was limited evidence that many players other than 25-player raiders were actually doing 10-player Ulduar hard modes, but they decided to put it in anyway, for the better, I think personally. Following Trial of the Crusader, we have Ice Crown Citadel, which was the final major raid tier of Wrath of the Lich King, where things once again changed, but less so than in Trial. Blizzard noted that players would go on to clear Trial of the Crusader up to 4 times a week for the upgrade trophies, if nothing else, and it was already a source of burnout in this near 1-room encounter, or 2 I guess you could call it. Imagine that system in a mega 12 boss raid like Ice Crown Citadel. Fortunately, Blizzard did foresee this eventuality and made it so you could dynamically swap between normal or heroic lockout for bosses within ICC. The attempt system lived on into ICC as well, and each of the last tier of bosses were open sequentially week after week to stagger the process and hype that end fight up with Arthas that little bit more. There was also the Ruby Sanctum afterwards, but no further significant changes were made until the Cataclysm landed. In any event, you can see several trends from the 40 and 20-man raid to vanilla to the 25 and 10 heroic and normal of Wrath of the Lich King. Some goals that Blizzard wished to meet with their raid content, you could say. Number 1, make more people be able to see raids. Number 2, make raids easier to manage and organize. And number 3, implement difficulty levels appropriate to all different types of player, from the casual to the hardcore. And I would say Wrath of the Lich King by the end was well on track, but not perfect. It's impressive though that Blizzard took on hand the issues with raiding that grew patch upon patch in Wrath of the Lich King, each time getting a bit closer to the format that works best overall, rather than resting on something that was good enough and just waiting to the next expansion to perform further large changes. I'd say raiding certainly changed for the better. I'm a person that enjoys the more challenging side that it can offer. There are also numerous other factors that affected raids too: catch-up gear, tier for all classes, itemization changes, removal of debuff slots and world buffs, many classes have the same debuffs covered, and so on and so forth. And still, the Lich King to this day is so well remembered as a fantastic culmination of an amazing expansion. Would it have been the same as 40 man? Would we have ever heard from Paragon? Maybe, but I doubt it. The Wrath of the Lich King raiding style still wasn't my favourite it's ever been in World of Warcraft, but from vanilla up to then, it certainly met a lot of the objectives it set out to achieve, and for that I admire Blizzard's courage and ability to quickly evolve and meet the demands they were being faced with. I'll leave it there though. Let me know your thoughts. I'd be happy to continue with the history of raiding, so if you guys like this, do give it a like and let me know so in the comments. I hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll see you all in the next one very soon. If you like what you see, do give the video a like and subscribe, as there will be plenty more to come. Thank you guys all so much for watching, and I will catch you in the next one.